My name is Kim T. Ha. I'm director of the Pennington Public Library, and we are happy to once again be collaborating with the Hopewell Valley Historical Society and the Hopewell Museum. Tonight, we are hosting Dr. Richard Veit, who will be presenting A Monument to Fallen Royalty, Rediscovering Joseph Bonaparte's Point Breeze Estate in Bordentown, New Jersey. If you have any questions during this presentation, please feel free to type them into the Q&A window. And for other comments, you may add these to the chat window. Dr. Veit will respond to your questions and comments in the Q&A session after this program. Now, before we start, I'd like to introduce Bob Warsnack, who represents both the Hopewell Valley Historical Society and the Hopewell Museum. Good evening, Bob. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Kim. Thank you. And good evening, everyone. I'm Bob Warsnack. I'm the chairperson of the Joint Program Committee that creates the programming for both the Hopewell Valley Historical Society and the Hopewell Museum, and I serve on both boards. We are grateful for our partnerships with other local organizations that have an interest in our shared history. I'm very pleased to once again be able to partner with our friends at the Pennington Public Library. It is getting close to a year since most of our programming has gone virtual. In the past, our live programs only reach the surrounding community. However, through the use of virtual tools like Zoom, we are now able to expand the service to a much broader audience that shares their love of this area. We are thrilled to offer these programs free to the public. However, we do depend on your generous donations and memberships. So please be sure to check out the Hopewell Valley Historical Society at www.hopewellvalleyhistory.org or our Hopewell Museum website at thehopewellmuseum.org. And that will keep you up to date on the monthly programs that we offer, or you can make an online donation to either organization. You can also join the Hopewell Valley Historical Society, where you can sign up for our annual membership and receive a year-long subscription to our well-researched newsletters. If you do check either or both websites, be sure to register for our next program, Trolley Car in the House, the rescue of Trenton Transit number 288. J.R. May of the Trenton Trolley number 288 project will talk about the Trenton Trolley car that had a house built around it in Hamilton, New Jersey. He will relate his story about how they removed the trolley from the house and the process that they are now going through to restore it back to its former glory. And thank you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Bob. Now, before we begin, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Richard Veit. Dr. Richard Veit, PhD, is professor of anthropology and interim dean of the Wayne D. McMurray School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Monmouth University. A North American historical archaeologist, his research focuses on the colonial Middle Atlantic region. He is the author of 7 books and has been the recipient of the Monmouth University's Distinguished Teacher Award. Welcome, welcome, Dr. Veit.
Oh, thank you so much, Kim. It is a pleasure to be here. So my presentation this evening is titled A Monument to Fallen Royalty, Rediscovering Joseph Bonaparte's Point Breeze Estate. And this is a story that has recently been in the news and in the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer, thanks to the acquisition of a substantial portion of what was Joseph Bonaparte's estate by the state of New Jersey through the Delaware and Raritan Greenway and other state programs, particularly the Green Acres program. So it's a very timely presentation. It's also going to be, as you see, a little bit of a story of archaeological mystery. So here is our protagonist. This is Monsieur Saviglieri, an individual who in 1815 sailed from France to North America to the port of New York on a vessel appropriately called the Commerce. Approaching the port of New York, the vessel was actually intercepted and stopped by a British warship so that they could inspect the cargo of the vessel and question the passengers in order to see if anyone fleeing from France related to the Bonaparte regime was on board. This individual remained in his cabin during that inspection and safely made it into the port of New York. Shortly thereafter, while walking on the streets of lower Manhattan, a French soldier saw him, fell at his feet, and cried out, "Your Majesty, how glad I am to see you." This was rather embarrassing because our mysterious stranger was, in fact, Joseph Bonaparte, the former king of Spain and Naples, the older brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, who had fled to North America following the Battle of Waterloo at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Joseph would spend the next 2+ decades of his life living in North America, and he created a most interesting life for himself here. Initially, he attempted to go to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Madison and claim diplomatic asylum here in the United States. Madison, however, thought that was not a fabulous idea and encouraged Bonaparte to stay in Philadelphia, which he did. Madison was afraid of having an international diplomatic incident with Great Britain. And you must remember that only a few short years before, we had been at war with Great Britain, the War of 1812. In fact, British troops had sacked Washington, D.C. Now, Joseph was something, until fairly recently, was something of a minor historical figure. And in 2005, Patricia Tyson Stroud wrote a very fine book published by the University of Pennsylvania Press titled The Man Who Had Been King. Shortly after that book came out, my colleagues and I at Monmouth University began an archaeological survey of the Point Breeze estate where Joseph lived for much of his American sojourn. And it's an example of what you might call landscape archaeology, in that we were very interested not just in the buildings that Joseph built, but also the landscape he created. Because after he arrived in America, he bought numerous farms, cobbled together a very large estate, roughly 2,000 acres, on the banks of Crosswicks Creek and the Delaware River. And it really became an American showplace. Gardens in early America, and by gardens in this case, I'm not really referring to sort of vegetable gardens for which our state, New Jersey, is famous, but formal gardens were an important part of the landscape in early America, and they were used by wealthy individuals to project their influence, to reflect their importance and their knowledge, and sort of to reinforce their owners' social status. So gardens spoke volumes to early Americans. When Joseph gets to America, after he decides to remain, he has to find a property to live where he will establish himself. And he looks at a number of different properties. He's renting initially in New York and later in Philadelphia, but he wants to have an estate similar to the ones he was familiar with in Europe. He did have a hunting lodge in upstate New York in what today is Fort Drum, and he was renting a townhouse in Philadelphia. He looked at a number of fine houses. One of the buildings he looked at was called Lansdowne, and this stood in Philadelphia. It was the Penn family's estate. He was able to rent it, but the owner was unwilling to sell it, so he couldn't buy Lansdowne, and that's what you're looking at here. In New Jersey, he looked at a rather famous estate, which was centered around a building called the Proprietary House. And this is the Proprietary House, also called the Old Bruin House or the Westminster. This had been the home of New Jersey's last royal governor, William Franklin, who had lived in Perth Amboy. It was a large estate, but Joseph was unsatisfied with the view. There were a number of houses between the Proprietary House and the nearest body of water, which was the Arthur Kill. And Joseph wanted to have those houses removed. When he was unable to do so, he decided not to purchase the Proprietary House. He apparently also looked at, and this gives you an idea of the scale of the buildings he was considering. He looked at the Dorincourt Hotel on Schooley's Mountain. So this is a massive early 19th century resort associated with a famous mineral spring. And there's a wonderful story here that I think is actually false, but I'm going to tell you anyway. When he was about to sign the mortgage for this house, he apparently spied on the wall of the building a painting that showed Napoleon's forces in retreat. He was so upset by this that he asked that the painting be covered because he could not go on with the legal paperwork while looking at it. When the owner of the hotel laughed, not taking this request seriously, Joseph is said to have stormed out in a peak of anger. Whether or not that actually happened, we do not know. However, the ledger, the visitor's ledger from one of the Schooley's Mountain hotels does survive, and it in fact has Joseph Bonaparte's signature in it. So he certainly was in this area, whether or not he considered this building for his permanent American home. Ultimately, he would settle on an estate in Bordentown, New Jersey. Once the estate of the individual you see here in the small vignette, this is Stephen Sayre, and Sayre was a noteworthy individual in early America. He was born on Long Island. He had married quite well. He served in a diplomatic post during the American Revolution. He had been briefly High Sheriff of London. His American sympathies, in fact, landed him in the Tower of London. And in the post-Revolutionary War era, he was living on overextended credit on a very large estate. And when Joseph was traveling between Philadelphia and New York, Bordentown is really very much in the center of America's main road in colonial America. He found a willing buyer. The painting you see here is one of many wonderful illustrations that survive of Point Breeze, and you can see the main house, at least one incarnation of it, and a small temple form building. This is probably Crosswicks Creek in front of us and the Delaware in the distance. And the bottom right, you're looking at a watercolor, unfortunately in black and white, by Captain Joshua Watson, that shows Point Breeze as it appeared during Sayre's era, before Joseph buys it. And he purchases it in 1816. This is a map just to orient you, so you can see where Bordentown is here, right at the waist, the narrow waist of New Jersey. And here is a table in French showing Joseph's land acquisitions in and around Bordentown. So he starts out with just over 200 acres for which he pays $17,000, quite a bargain. And he continues acquiring land in what today would be Bordentown and Hamilton Township until he has roughly 2,000 acres of land. This is a fine map, and many of the graphics we're going to be looking at were put together by my good friend and colleague and partner in this project, Michael Gall. This shows in blue the original property that Joseph acquired, which is quite large. It stretches up Crosswicks Creek, and then some of the other properties that he purchased later. Joseph would also sell some properties in order to raise funds. One of the challenges he faced living in New Jersey was that during this time period, foreign nationals, and he was very much a foreign national as the former king of Spain, could not own land outright in the state. So Joseph had to purchase the land through an agent. His agent was a man named James Carre. However, he would later, this is a document from 1825, he would later petition the state of New Jersey for the right to own the land and to clear the title to the land so that it could be passed from him to his heirs. He had two daughters. This is a copy of that legal document, which actually allowed him to own the land, and it survives in the collections of the Beinecke Library at Yale University. Now, you may be wondering how an exiled king on the run is able to afford such a big piece of prime real estate in New Jersey. And the way he's able to afford this is because he has brought to America, or had brought to America, what were probably the Spanish crown jewels. And he did that through the assistance of this individual. So the small picture to the right, the miniature portrait that you see, is Louis Maillard. Louis Maillard was one of Joseph's servants, a member of his household, is how Joseph would have put it. And after Joseph arrives in America, he dispatches Louis back to an estate that Joseph had owned in Switzerland. Louis has a map. It's literally a map that has an X on it. And he is there supposed to excavate until he hits a metal trunk. Uh, Mr. Maillard carries out this assignment, digs down, hits a trunk, sends the workmen away, unearths that trunk, and brings it back to America. We believe that it contained uh, both jewelry of great value and also papers of extreme value to the Bonaparte family. What you see on the left reproduced is another document from the Yale University archives, which relate to the Maillard family. And it is from a merchant house in Amsterdam, essentially noting that Mr. Maillard will be arriving soon with a small package of important objects that must be taken great care of. So Louis Maillard plays a major role in helping support Joseph's activities in North America. Now, when Joseph buys this property, there's already a house there, and this house, which stands on Farnsworth Avenue in downtown Bordentown, may well be that original house. People in 18th and 19th century America moved houses with surprising regularity. Now, the house itself appears to be a 19th century structure from the mansard roofs or Second Empire style, but it was likely reworked. And in fact, the homeowners did find a series of papers relating to Point Breeze and Joseph Bonaparte in this structure. So we think that Joseph moves the original house off the property, the house that the Sayre family would have built, and he's going to build his own house. Now, a little foreshadowing of the archaeology to come. So one of the things that Joseph rather is unaware of when he buys this property is that he is acquiring a piece of land within the bounds of New Jersey's most famous archaeological site. Now, you may not be familiar with New Jersey's most famous archaeological site, but that site is the Abbott Farm National Historical Landmark, which stretches from Hamilton Township up into Trenton and down into Bordentown. It is named after this dapper gentleman with the cigar in his mouth and a bowler on his head, Charles Conrad Abbott, New Jersey's first archaeologist. I am a fan of Abbott, and a wonderful biography of him just came out, written by Carolyn Dillion and Charles Bellow. Abbott was famous for arguing that human beings had lived in the Delaware Valley for 10,000 years or more. And he based that argument on artifacts he found on his wife's farm, a farm called the Three Beaches. Artifacts like these that looked very simple and quite ancient and were similar to artifacts being found in France and Belgium and Germany at about the same time. As it turns out, Abbott's dates were a little off. However, he's important for opening the door to a deep prehistory for North America. Abbott would later write that the entirety of Point Breeze, Joseph's estate, was a large archaeological site, and he was correct. Later, Dorothy Cross, New Jersey's first state archaeologist, today Greg Latanzi is our state archaeologist. Dorothy Cross carried out excavations at the Abbott Farm that sort of disproved these theories from the late 19th and early 20th century. I show you this picture because Dorothy is here supervising her students from Douglas College and from Hunter University with a couple of assistants. And I just want you to notice how well dressed they are. The students I'll show you in a little bit are much less formal. One other fun archaeological fact about Joseph is that his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, was busy actually doing archaeology in Italy in the area called Etruria, where there were ancient Etruscan sites, and he was entering Etruscan tombs, recovering ancient vessels like these, which he sent to Joseph that were later displayed at Point Breeze. Today they survive at the University of Pennsylvania in their wonderful museum. Joseph also made note of the fact that Native American artifacts were unearthed while construction projects were going on his property. In fact, he lays out roughly 12 miles of roads. It's good to be the king, or at least the former king. And this bridge, we believe, is the one that he calls the Indian Point Bridge. And it is near a very rich and important Native American pre-contact site. He calls it the Pont du Sauvage Bridge. Unfortunately, my colleague Mike Gall and my other colleague Bill Schindler and I, while doing archaeology here, found evidence for looting of the archaeological remains. And that is illegal, as this is private property. These are some of the artifacts that were still left behind, bits of pottery and a projectile point. All right, so Joseph is in America. He has acquired this property. And I want to take you through the history of the property before we dig deeply into the archaeology. We have a number of wonderful paintings that show the property over time. Again, several buildings up here. I would also welcome you to reach out to me at the end of this presentation if you know of other artistic depictions of the property or artifacts from it. Here you see the house. Again, there's the Delaware. Here is the here's Crosswicks Creek winding into the Delaware. Notice how the house is going to expand over time. There's another view of it. Very rural, right? Probably fishing, perhaps for shad down here. This is not Point Breeze, but this may be a reasonable sort of parallel. This is a house in western Monmouth County constructed by Samuel Gardner Wright, who is a New Jersey senator in the 18 teens. It's called Merino Hill. And it's a very fine house of the style that Point Breeze was constructed in. The name Merino Hill is apparently associated with the fact that Samuel G. Wright purchased merino sheep, possibly from Joseph Bonaparte at a time when merino sheep were all the rage for gentlemen farmers. This is another historic structure that has an important association with Joseph and Point Breeze. This is a building called Bow Hill in Hamilton Township. It's a fine late 18th century building built by an individual named Barnt de Klein. Barnt de Klein was a merchant who had done very, very well, and he thought that the capital of the United States was likely to be constructed in Trenton. So he built a fine home in the hopes of being close to the national capital. As it turns out, the national capital was moved to some swampy area down by Maryland and Virginia and has remained there ever since. It's a thriving city today. But the house survives, and it was the home of Anne Savage, who is Joseph's paramour or girlfriend for much of his American sojourn. Here you see Point Breeze, Bonaparte's mansion, sort of full blown, fully developed. So remember the rather small house we were looking at? Now it has grown 2 large wings. There's a separate building over here with a tower. You'll also note there's a little bit of symbolism in this wonderful painting by Charles Lawrence. The sun is shining up here. The sun is shining on Bow Hill, the home where Anne Savage lives. This is another very nice painting by Birch that shows Point Breeze. Now, during this time period, it's actually described as the second finest house in America, presumably after the White House. So it is really an extraordinary building. It's based on structures that Joseph would have known in France and Switzerland, such as Mortefontaine, one of his homes there. So this is a little bit more chateau-esque, but the setting is very similar, as is the arrangement of the building with the central block and wings. Now, I am presenting Joseph in a very positive light, and a good friend of mine, David Orr, formerly of Temple University, has reminded me that when I talk about Joseph, I should point out that he is a problematic historical figure. Indeed, as king of Spain, he was beset by guerrilla warfare, and he executed numerous people who rebelled against his reign. And here you can see the execution of some rebels against Bonapartist rule in Spain. This is a painting by Goya. So he is not always a positive individual. Now, archaeologists have something we call the Pompeii premise. And the Pompeii premise is based on the famous archaeological site of Pompeii. And the idea is when a site is catastrophically destroyed, that is good for archaeologists, if not for people who lived at the site. So in January of 1820, Joseph's first great house at Point Breeze is destroyed by a fire. People from the neighborhood, including women and children, and this is a painting or an illustration rather from a children's book, arrive and attempt to douse the flames at the house. Joseph is not home at the time. He's believed to have been in Trenton, perhaps visiting with Anne Savage. So he returns home literally to see the roof of his grand palatial house collapsing in. It must have been terribly shocking. The only piece of that first house that survives the fire is a tower called the Belvedere for a very good view. And that is going to survive well into the 19th century. And this is a painting by Carl Bodmer. Carl Bodmer is well known for painting Native American leaders on the Great Plains. And he visited Point Breeze, painted the estate, but it appears that Joseph was not home at the time. This is the second mansion that Joseph will erect. Now, one of the wonderful things from an archaeological perspective is when the first house burns, Joseph does not rebuild on its footprint. Rather, he turns what had been the stables into a second grand house. And these are the former stables at Point Breeze, turned into a mansion. Quite impressive, I think. There are a number of illustrations that show that complex. So here's the main house, also with a tower. You see a house he built for his daughters, Zenaide and Charlotte, who come to visit him. You see what's sometimes called the gardener's cottage over here. Now, if we had the opportunity to visit with Joseph, and I think there would be very few people more interesting to visit with in 19th century New Jersey, we would have been stunned by the artwork displayed in his home. This is a painting by Jacques-Louis David showing Napoleon crossing the Alps, which was on display in his house. Realize this is a time period when most people have little exposure to art. This would have just been stunning. This is a scale model or of a sculpture of his sister, who is also displayed here looking like a recumbent ancient Roman goddess. but was also displayed in the house. And this was seen as a somewhat scandalous sculpture because of the relative lack of clothing. The art collection that Joseph has is frankly unparalleled in early America, with 128 paintings by European masters. Some of these paintings still survive in the United States, others are now in Europe. The estate itself is also magnificent, with beautiful views of the Delaware, sculpture displayed outside on patios and verandas. And it becomes perhaps the best known of the fine estates in the Delaware Valley. We have a number of paintings showing the estate and the environments. And it was a favorite of painters during the 19th century because of the beautiful, picturesque landscape. Now, this is perhaps the least polished of the images I've shown you, but maybe the most interesting from an archaeological perspective. So we begin our archaeological excavations in about 2008, and our research a little bit before that. This is a painting that was found, a drawing that was found in the municipal archives at Versailles, and it shows the main house at Point Breeze, some of the ancillary structures, the gardener's cottage, the lake house, a lake that Joseph had created, the site of the original mansion, which has been the focus of our archaeology to date, and some of the other structures, such as a fish pond. So this is what the site looks like today. Beautiful manicured lawns. Until recently, the campus of Divine Word Missionaries. And this is roughly where archaeologically we've found the core of the mansion. One piece of our project was not just excavating, and archaeology is certainly about excavating and interpreting artifacts. We were also interested in traces, surface features that survived on the estate from the time period when Joseph lived there. And you can see some of them outlined here in red on this beautiful map put together, again, by my colleague, Mike Gall. And this is the Divine Word Missionaries campus. There are docks and wharves. Joseph had his own boat described as a row galley to bring him to Philadelphia. There are stairways leading down to the water. This is another dock, what's left of it. Here's another one exposed at low tide. This is a dike he had thrown across the end of one of the creeks that leads into Crosswicks Creek, thereby creating a pond for fishing and boating and ice skating in winter. And it's almost reminiscent of the nearby Delaware and Raritan Canal, in that there was a little lock in this dam that Joseph had constructed so they could raise and lower the water level. This is another view of that feature. So we documented those structures. The site is also famous for its tunnels, or to use a more sort of learned term, it's crypto-portici. These are underground passageways that connect the docks and wharves to the mansion, and connect the second mansion with other structures such as the lake house. They survive today. I find them both fascinating and at the same time a little bit terrifying, because working out there with students, these are intriguing places, but they haven't been maintained for centuries, and you don't want someone to get hurt in one of these structures. We also have wonderful postcard views. This shows the steps going down to the water from the early 20th century. Here are some of the roads that Joseph laid out, very visible in late fall and winter. There's a postcard view again of one of these roads. And the core of the estate is the area that was recently acquired for preservation. And you can see some of the roads laid out on this map. And it's surprising just how much survives from the Bonaparte state. He built bridges and really created a showplace in early America that so many people visited and talked about. Now, our archaeology is focused primarily on the first mansion, which was a lost archaeological site until we found it. And again, sort of employing that Pompeii premise, it was destroyed catastrophically in a fire and then not rebuilt. So we have the possibility of really understanding aspects of life with the Bonapartes from the archaeology there. The second mansion complex is preserved, what survives of it, but it has not seen archaeology yet. That's on the docket for the future. These are some views of the second mansion complex. Joseph built a house for his daughters, especially Princess Enaid, which survived into the late 19th century. Here it is after a fire. This is what it looks like today. Almost feels like you're in Belize or Guatemala looking at Mayan ruins. The gardener's house is the only surviving structure on the property from the Bonaparte era. And this shows it as it appeared in the late 19th century. Here it is today. And this may well be the focus of some future archaeological excavations. In the woods, these are actually the ruins of the lake house. So not very much left there. And this is what he called the wash or the tenant house. Again, about 1880 and what it looks like today. So traces on the landscape, even centuries after Joseph has left the scene. One of my favorite pictures, kind of mysterious, from the 19th century, shows an entrance to one of the tunnels with what appears to be a group of school children. And here is the tunnel at the second mansion. I had the scariest experience here where I was giving a tour to a local group, and I went down to point out the entrance to the tunnel, not realizing that it had become the roost for a turkey buzzard, which came flapping out just like, you know, a vampire in a movie. It was completely terrifying. Took years off my life. After Joseph leaves the estate, and he will return to Europe twice in the 1830s, involved in politics again in Europe, and finally returns permanently in 1838, 1839. He will return to Europe. The property is maintained by an estate manager. And finally, after he passes away, Joseph passes away, that is, in the 1840s, Henry Becket acquires the property. Becket is an English diplomat. He tears down the second mansion. It probably was a terrible maintenance chore beyond his financial capacity. And he builds a very nice Victorian house that stood into the 20th century. Point Breeze becomes sort of a private park used for Grand Army of the Republic reunions in the years after the American Civil War. Later, in the very early 20th century, it's acquired by Harris Hammond, the wealthy son of a mining magnate who plans to restore the tunnels and some of the other structures. And this is a drawing from that time period. However, the Great Depression brings those plans to a screeching halt. And ultimately, Divine Word missionaries will acquire the property in 1941. Hammond did put up this, it's sometimes called the Chinese grotto, this amazing stonework with pools and fountains that still survives on the property. And in the summer of 2007, with all of that as backstory, we began our archaeological excavations. At that point, I should tell you, we did not have a map that showed where the first house stood. The map that depicts it was not found until after our project began. It was found through the good efforts of Suzanne Moore, a Monmouth University graduate student. We began by excavating shovel tests across this large expanse of lawn. And once we started finding artifacts, we opened up larger excavations. So here's some students. This is one of my colleagues who's very involved in the project. Bill Schindler, another colleague, Sean McHugh back here. Let me go back. This is Michael Gall, who's another key member of our team. We started excavating shovel tests, and almost immediately, we started finding artifacts and archaeological features. This is our first actual shovel test, and we're down probably 2.5 feet, and you can see there's about 8 to 10 inches of ash at the bottom, and all of the soil above it is full of broken brick bats and mortar. So pretty exciting to have your first shovel test go right into the cellar of a early 19th century building. The students have really an excellent experience because they are learning by doing. This is Allison Gall, one of our instructors, working with the students on taking notes and interpreting what we're finding. Ultimately, we're able to identify the site of the first mansion, as well as a number of other features. Now, one thing we didn't initially have the benefit of, but later we bring to bear is a new technology that's incredibly useful to archaeologists. So we were able to do ground penetrating radar at the site. We actually had 3 different campaigns of ground penetrating radar, one by Bob Winsek. He works for a firm named EPI. Another one, and the one you're looking at here, was conducted, this survey was conducted by a fellow named Tim Horsley. And this is probably our most detailed image. Bob Winsek's work helped us find the site. Here, though, you can see not only the building, the outline of the main house, and these little squares in black, those are the places where we excavated. So we've only sort of scratched the surface. We also found a number of other structures. There's another building here. You can sort of see the outline of it. And there's a wing to the structure over here. There's another building up here. So it's very rich archaeological site. Besides all of these historic features, there are also pre-contact artifacts, Native American artifacts from cooking fires, projectile points, and pottery. This is one of our excavations, and what we're trying to do here is reveal the wall of the building. And this area is inside the structure, that area is outside the structure. We tried to find the 4 corners of the structure. We also recovered roughly 23,000 artifacts, a mind-boggling, mind-numbing number of artifacts, which we are still doing our final processing on today as we wrap up the report on the 3 years of fieldwork we did at the site. Among the artifacts were numerous fragments of wine bottles, which you see here. These are in fact one of the most common finds at Point Breeze. Lots of nails, which aren't all that exciting for folks other than archaeologists, but help us date the site. Fragments of molten lead and copper, and lots of pieces of glass with phrasing and silvered backs. It turns out that these are fragments of mirrors. So imagine almost a hall of mirrors as you enter this grand house. It looked perhaps like this, but on an even finer scale. And this is a house in downtown Philadelphia, Rittenhouse Square. Lots of fragments of marble, both from floors, as you see here, and probably pieces of statues were recovered. Fragments of mantelpieces, in this case, charred by the fire. For an archaeologist working in Turkey or Greece or Italy, finding marble might not be unusual. For an archaeologist working in New Jersey or Pennsylvania, it's pretty exciting. There are pieces of hardware from doorknobs, furniture tacks, drawer pulls. And this is one of my favorite artifacts. So it's very tiny. It's only about the size of your thumbnail. This is a little bit of a picture frame. And remember, Joseph had one of the finest art collections in North America. He also had one of the finest libraries in North America. So that may be a bit of a painting that perhaps did not survive the fire. Here is some of that glass, thick glass from mirrors. Mirrors were hard to make during this time period. France was the nation that led the world in the manufacture of mirrors. So it's perhaps unsurprising that Joseph had mirrors throughout the building. And then there were numerous fragments of copper, which lead us to believe that perhaps some or all of the roof of the building was made out of copper. Here is the base of a small porcelain urn, perhaps like this one on display in a historic house museum. And these are a couple of my favorite finds. This shattered shallow bowl came out of the ground in a lot of pieces, and it was completely blackened when it came out of the ground. It was in a layer of charcoal. As we washed it, an image came up on the surface of the bowl, and it showed this woman who looks very pensive with a flag behind her and a sail. Up here, we see acorns and oak leaves, gilt decoration, and it says in French, scenes from Roman history. So imagine a spring meal at Point Breeze, where maybe you're eating strawberries out of a bowl like this. This is a very, very elaborate earthenware teapot, sometimes called caneware, this style. It's actually English, it's not French, and it's very fancy. It shows these little cherubs or putti that are eating grapes and shoving grapes into each other's mouths, kind of wrestling with each other. We know it was made in Great Britain in the 18 teens. So we get an idea of how this king in exile was setting his table. There's a close-up of it. Outside of the main house, we found other structures. This is colleague Adam Heinrich and Scott Wyzorek. We're excavating what we believe was probably an out kitchen. Kitchens were often separated from houses because of the fire danger that a kitchen presented during this time period. We've mapped many of the features at the second mansion, but again, that's an area yet to be excavated. So let's try and bring it all together. What does Point Breeze mean? This is one of the finest estates in early America, and one of the finest estates in the Delaware Valley. And it has an impact on people and society in the Delaware, as its owner, Joseph Bonaparte, has. Many noteworthy individuals visited Point Breeze. Here you see some of them: Henry Clay, the Marquis de Lafayette, who's something of a frustration because in the 1820s, when he visits North America, he stops twice at Point Breeze to meet with Joseph Bonaparte. However, his diary is not as revealing as we would like. He says things like, Point Breeze is so well known that there's no need for me to say anything about it. You also see Commodore Stockton over here, and Daniel Webster, who looks very glum. I like to think that if he had been eating and drinking with Joseph when this was taken, he probably would have looked happier. There are a lot of contemporary descriptions, and this is one of the beauties of the type of archaeology I like doing, historical archaeology. We can bring together documents, images, artifacts, archaeological features to better understand the past. So here's some things that people said about Point Breeze. Edward D. Montoul said, the estate should someday be very comfortable. It's kind of a mixed compliment, right? We want people to say our houses are comfortable now, not in the future. William Harris said that Joseph was laying out some of the spoils of Europe in an elegant mansion and grounds. He was, that it's a little bit cynical. William Dalton said that the house was princely in appearance, but surrounded by poor land. I would beg to differ. The fathers who lived at Point Breeze, part of Divine Word missionaries, had the most incredible vegetable gardens. David Douglas notes that the estate consisted of pleasure grounds laid out in the English style, and they were picturesque. They were not formal in the sense of rigidly geometric. Instead, they were meant to look natural, and that was sometimes called the English or even the Chinese style. And Andrew Bell talked about it, and he's there late in the period. He's looking at the second house as a mean-looking building. Rather a cynical fellow, that Bell. But this is my favorite description. This is from Thomas Gordon's Gazetteer of the state of New Jersey. And he describes the estate as follows. With characteristic liberality, the Count has opened his grounds to the public, but we regret to perceive that he has been ungratefully repaid by the defacement of his ornamental structures and mutilation of his statues. So this says to me that people are talking back to the landscape that Joseph has created. They're out on his property, knocking the nose off statues in the garden, painting things on his building, essentially doing things he doesn't want them to do. That said, Joseph replicates in North America a little bit of European grandeur. So here you see the lake house, and here you see the lake on his estate at Mortefontaine. This is a view of the Point Breeze estate. Here is a view of the Bonaparte family estate in Corsica. And again, note these similarities. He's really recreating the world that he knew in Europe. Joseph also leaves behind a very interesting legacy. As a patron of the arts and of science here in North America, he belongs to every organization you can think of. He sponsors operas. He lends out his paintings. He opens his gardens and, frankly, his house to visitors, and it becomes a famous spot. He's also sort of running a salon, if you will. So noted people, diplomats, come and visit him at Point Breeze and seek out his advice. That legacy continues. So Joseph Bonaparte has what you might call a half-life that continues even after he returns to Europe and ultimately passes away. If you visit the Bordentown post office, there's a beautiful WPA mural that shows Joseph Bonaparte and Louis Maillard distributing fruit, oranges, and it looks like grapefruits to the children of Bordentown on the pond he had created, with his house towering in the background. Items from the house survive in collections across the Middle Atlantic. At Merino Hill, this bust of the famous blind poet Homer is on display, believed to be from Point Breeze. We wonder if it lost its nose while displayed at Point Breeze. Bordentown was called the King City for a while, and here is a little advertising card from the King City restaurant. Pieces of furniture from Point Breeze survive in many collections. One of the beautiful fireplaces, now housed by the Burlington County Historical Society, was once at Point Breeze. Letters and even advertisements for the estate. This one rather from the 1930s. An unusual opportunity to buy a unique and distinguished estate. I would say so. And then finally, every good archaeological story should have a grail. So this is in fact a chalice that survives in Bordentown that was used in a chapel on the estate and is now in the collection of a local Roman Catholic church. Indiana Jones would love it. Today, Point Breeze is again in the news. The TV show Drive-By History filmed an episode there talking about the unknown history or little known history of Point Breeze. And as I mentioned earlier, the estate has recently been acquired in large part by the state of New Jersey through the Delaware and Raritan Greenway and the Green Acres program, and also by the city of Bordentown, and will be preserved into the future. And this is Peter Tucci, one of my good colleagues and friends, who was instrumental in helping make that happen. So I hope that you've enjoyed this introduction to the history and archaeology of Point Breeze and Joseph Bonaparte, a king who spent much of his life here in New Jersey. And I'd like to thank some of the many individuals who made this project possible. And most importantly, but not shouted out in this slide, thanks especially to my students and colleagues at Monmouth University who've made my work at Point Breeze over the years possible. And here's some of those students. And just think back to the image we saw before of Dorothy Cross and her students and colleagues. We're much less formal today. Thanks so much for spending part of your evening with me and with the Pennington Public Library and the Hopewell Valley Historical Society this evening. If you have any questions, I will try to address them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Veit. We do have a series of questions for you, and you probably see at the chat window a lot of people thanking you for your lovely presentation. So the excavation started, you said, in 2007, and you said you didn't have a map of where the first mansion was. Were you judging based on where to dig on the paintings that you showed us, or where did you know how to start?
Yeah, Kim, that's a great question. So we didn't have the map. The map was discovered after we started working there and people heard about our project. There is one large map of the estate from the 1840s, but it doesn't show the first house. The first house had been gone for 2 decades. That's at the Library of Congress. But we did have these tunnels. So we figured that tunnels must lead to the house, even though they're closed off today. So we used the tunnel as kind of our arrow, and we followed that, and it did in fact lead us to the house. So that was like the X marks the spot for us.
Wow, that sounds like an Indiana Jones type tale.
It was fun. It was fun and exciting.
Yes, I bet. There's a question about the final report that you are putting together. Will that be available as a public document?
That's a great question. I'm not 100% sure if it will be available generally, because often with sort of technical archaeological reports, they get filed with the State Historic Preservation Office, and some of that information is shared and some isn't. But there are, I'm happy to share relevant pieces with folks who could use it. And my colleague Mike Gall and I have published a couple of articles that sort of summarize what we've done. And I could share those as well.
Okay, that is wonderful. Jim has a question. Is there any kind of plant list for the estate, either from Joseph's era or later?
I don't know if there is a plant list. I know that folks have started looking at the plantings there because there are some significant trees that may date back to Joseph's time period. And he had a lot of exotic plantings. He was collecting plants. That's one of his hobbies. The Burlington County Historical Society actually has some receipts where he is purchasing trees and shrubs from Landreth Nurseries in Philadelphia. And he's doing it like he does everything. It's like, 60 Lombardy poplars. He doesn't do anything in a small way. So there is some documentation, and I think that would be a really fun project to sort of track down what he had planted there. That would be a great project. It's not what we've done, but it would be a very good project.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that the style of landscape architecture was more of a naturalistic style, because the library had a discussion about landscape architect Beatrix Farrand, who was after Joseph's generation, but how she brought that style to the United States. So now I'm curious whether or not he had any influence on her.
I don't know if he did, but so, I mean, if you think about the big formal gardens of the 18th century, they tend to be very rigid and geometric, and like at places like Versailles in France. And then it seems to almost spread out of China, where there's this ancient tradition of sort of garden design that is more naturalistic, and it's picked up in Europe in places like England, and comes here. So Jefferson, to some extent, is building in a little bit more picturesque way. Joseph is definitely focused on the picturesque. And then if you think about sort of like our early public parks, like Central Park in New York, that's essentially a picturesque garden. And some cemeteries too, ironically. And cemeteries are sort of like public parks in early America. So Laurel Hill in Philadelphia, the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, hills, plantings, water features. Yeah, so it's something that he's piece of, and a number of people pushed forward in the 19th century.
Yes, very fascinating. There's a question from RSW. Were many paintings and fine art objects destroyed during the fire at his estate?
So we think some were, but we don't know which pieces were destroyed during the fire. There's some correspondence in a newspaper article that survives from right after the fire, in which Joseph writes a letter to the local, I believe it's still local newspaper, essentially complimenting the people of Bordentown on saving his possessions. And he says essentially, my art, my silver, all he goes, were all saved, and it reflects so well on Americans and their spirit, their public mindedness. It's really a nice letter. But then for other folks, as I understand it, write back to the newspaper and say things like, well, why wouldn't we have saved it? Of course we did that. What did you think? We were going to steal stuff from you? So it becomes like a little, back and forth. And Mrs. Hopkinson, one of his neighbors, is actually helping him with his correspondence because he's not fully fluent in English during this time period. But from the archaeology, we have that little bit of a picture frame, but certainly a lot of pieces do survive today in collections, both in the United States and around the world.
How fascinating, a dialogue, almost like an early precursor to social media.
It is, right? Where you say something and then people come back and it keeps going.
That is wonderful. Barbara has a question. This is one of the early questions from your presentation. How large was the trunk that Louis Maillard brought back from Switzerland?
Yeah, that is a great question. I always pictured it sort of like a steamer trunk. The description in that letter that survives at Yale talks about a small package. What I've heard is that it has both pieces of the Spanish crown jewels, and Joseph later, when he tours people through the house, folks talk about him opening drawers, and there on velvet, are displayed crowns and things like that. So I've always assumed pieces like that were in it, but there's also a lot of correspondence as well. And there are stories, they may be apocryphal, but there are stories that his house is not burned down accidentally, that it's actually targeted for arson in an attempt to essentially do away with these papers, which might have been embarrassing to royal families in Europe that had been aligned with the Bonapartes, and then after Bonaparte's defeat, wanted to sort of forget that part of their history. We don't know, but that has been presented to me by folks at other presentations, and I find it intriguing. It then becomes sort of a spy story. So I don't know.
I was going to ask you, from your expertise, how likely would that have been?
I don't think it's particularly likely. Joseph's own sort of description of what happens is that a guest is staying in the house, leaves a fire burning in a fireplace, exits the house, locks the doors, and the fire somehow gets out of the grate and starts a fire that they have no easy way to control. So that's Joseph's description, which is much more mundane than sort of the house being burned down purposefully. Another story I've heard, again, probably apocryphal, is that Joseph, who was a very amorous fellow, he had lots of relationships, may have essentially annoyed one of his servants to the point, a Russian servant, she's often described as, to the point where she decides to do away with the house. It's a sort of a fantastical story. I suspect it's incorrect, but it is out there as one of the pieces of folklore around Point Breeze.
That is great. Thank you for sharing. Now, Alan asked, did he have any slaves? Were there slave quarters?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And New Jersey during the early 19th century had a substantial number of enslaved people, probably 10 to 15% of the population. So we have fairly good documentation on Joseph. And it does not appear from the written records that he had any slaves. Um, he does appear as having sort of a major domo or a manager of the house, maybe a butler, if you will, who is described as a very imposing African American man, uh, well dressed and sort of towering. So if you were to essentially knock on the door, he would be the person who greets you. Um, but he appears to have been an employee rather than an enslaved person. Um, One other person who shows up in some of the descriptions, and you have to imagine sort of a whole staff for this estate, right? Is a bodyguard who is described as, again, sort of a very imposing Hungarian cavalryman who is his sort of personal guard. But Joseph himself, and this is a fun part of the story that I didn't mention, um, he's like he's a little bit of a homebody. Like he's out, like, you know, touching up the paint on the house over here and trimming shrubs. And there's a famous story where some women come to visit, and there's this guy, and they describe him as like covered in dust, working on the plaster of the house. They basically say, like, we're here to see the king. Um, and he's like, oh yes, you know, go up there, knock on this door. And then they're greeted very formally by this servant. And a little while later, this same fellow that they saw working on the house pops up in a clean shirt now, and it was in fact Joseph who has changed, you know, clothes to greet his visitor. So I think he really would have been a fun person to meet.
See, that sounds like a story also from a movie or a TV show where you have, you know, the big kahuna and no one knows who he is type
Right, right.
story.
But there's that TV show now where, right, it's like, you know, sort of secret boss or something. It's almost like that. So
Yeah.
Joseph in disguise.
Yes. Yes. Do you know if there, from Robert, he has a question. Are there any houses from the same era still standing in Bordentown? Do you know?
Yeah, Bordentown has a pretty rich architectural history. So there are houses that even predate this one that are standing. There's a Hopkinson house. There frankly there are probably a dozen houses this age or earlier. It's too bad that this one doesn't survive, but the fact that it doesn't creates this archaeological opportunity.
Yes. Very interesting. Now, Teresa has a question. Speaking of Bordentown, are you familiar with Bordentown Military Institute? I had heard that it was Napoleon's home. Do you know anything about it?
Yeah, so the Bordentown Military Institute stood on the other side of Park Street, right across from the Point Breeze estate. And it is parts of it were a piece with the estate, and we think that members of Joseph's household and family probably did live on that property as well. So they were actually quite a well-known sort of private military academy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So yeah, there is something to that story. That's correct.
Okay, wow. Several people are asking whether the recording of this presentation will be available, and we are currently recording, and the library now has a YouTube channel, which took me a while to set up, but we do have one right now. We do not have enough people to have our own dedicated URL, however. So if you want to subscribe to our Pennington Public Library YouTube channel, then perhaps we can reach that goal of 100 subscribers and have our own dedicated URL. For now, you can go to YouTube, type in the search bar, Pennington Public Library, and you will see our YouTube channel. I am posting recordings a month to 2 months after the live presentation. So feel free to check out our YouTube channel.
Sounds good.
Yes. David wants to know if any part of the state grounds are open to the public today.
So I'm not sure how that's going to be handled moving forward. Until recently, while Divine Word was still maintaining ownership of the property, they allowed regular tours that I would do, Peter Tucci would do, my colleague Mike Gall would do several times a year, typically through Friends of the Bordentown Hamilton Marsh. And in fact, that organization has a website, and I would check their website about the possibility of future tours. But I can't say because we're sort of in a transitional period when the property is open now.
Do you know, Dr. Veit, if there were pre-pandemic tours of the estate ever?
Yes, there were.
Okay.
There were a number
Yeah,
of-
Barbara had that question.
Yes.
Todd has a question. Can you comment on the workers, craftsmen who built the mansion? Were they local or were they imported from Europe?
Oh, that's a fabulous question too. So we're not 100% sure who the architect would have been. Joseph may have designed the buildings himself or with the assistance of a professional architect. The Bouvier family, you think of Jackie Kennedy, her family, they were French emigres in Philadelphia who were famous for their fine furniture that they were making. So they were clearly involved in furnishing the house and may have been involved in design and construction of the building. In fact, there's a great video um, that shows Jackie Kennedy when she had first become a first lady, and she's taking some guests on a tour of the White House. And she points out some furniture, and I think if I recall correctly, she highlights a piece of furniture made by one of her ancestors, I think Michel Bouvier, that had been displayed or used at Point Breeze, which is super cool, I think.
Wow. The connections. That is amazing. I'm sure you can almost do like a Kevin Bacon with
Yes,
Joseph Bonaparte and the people of that time period and later.
Yes, it is. It's like a couple degrees of separation, right?
Yes, yes. Steve has a question. I think also Claudia had the same question. In the pictures of your artifacts, you had a checkerboard type item that you displayed, some sort of measurement type tool. Could you elaborate on this tool and what it's called?
I should have spoken to that. Yeah, so that's a little archaeological convention. So when archaeologists take photographs of artifacts, there's often a question of like, how big is that? So we try and put a scale in the photograph whenever we're photographing artifacts. So that's a centimeter ruler. So each of those little black or white boxes is 1 centimeter. So it gives you an idea of how big the artifacts are. That's a really good question. I should have said that while I was presenting. So thanks for asking.
Well, that's helpful to have. I know sometimes even just looking at my everyday pictures, I wonder, wait, how big is that?
Right.
So Joe has a question. Would you know, did Spain or England try to extradite Joseph Bonaparte?
There was a fear that that he would be extradited to England. I don't think it ever could have been realized, but he is certainly when he flees to America, when he comes to America, he talks extensively with his brother Napoleon and encourages his brother also to leave, to come to the Americas, either North or South America, for his own safety. And Napoleon refuses to do so. He thinks it would be dishonorable to do so. And he says, I will remain behind and I'll be well treated by the English. It's not really true. They put him on a small island off the coast of Africa, where eventually he passes away. So Joseph, if he had not fled to America, almost certainly would have been imprisoned. Whether he would have suffered the same fate as his brother is unclear. And certainly, one of the stories associated with Point Breeze is that he creates these tunnels, in part is escape routes from the house, so that if anyone ever does try to nab him, he'll be able to run away. He's often more matter of fact than the stories about him are. He says the tunnels are essentially to keep the servants dry as they're moving things from ships into the house and from building to building, which is nowhere near as romantic as his escape tunnels. Other folks have said, going back to the tunnels, that those are so that he can secretly bring his his girlfriends in and out of the house. He does have a an active romantic life, but he doesn't seem particularly secretive about it. So I don't think he would have needed tunnels for that.
Oh, but that would have made such a fun story, I think. Apparently, you're not the only one who knows this story, because one of our participants, one of our attendees, also mentioned that she heard stories about his paramours and tunnels as well. So,
yeah, he has a number of relationships. His longest term, he is married. His wife never chooses to join him in America. Julie Clary, there's quite a bit of correspondence where he's asking her repeatedly to come to America, and she says that she's too frail and it's too dangerous. And eventually, he does strike up this fairly long-term relationship with Anne or Annette Savage, and they go on to have 2 children. But then ultimately, he has relationships as well with some of his servants, with the wife of a diplomat who stays with him. So there may well be descendants of Joseph in the audience this evening. Never know.
you never know. If you have a suspicion, maybe you can look into it. You just answered Lois's question, because she said that she read Queen's Fortune by Alison Pataki, and she had asked if you could elaborate on Joseph and whether or not Julie spent time with him at Point Breeze, but apparently she never
doesn't. And I think it's kind of sad, because he really did. He writes these letters that are just gushing about how great America is and how she would love it. And the food is good and the people are nice, and this whole democracy thing, he's kind of fond of it. And she chooses not to. And I mean, there's something a little bit ironic in that she says, I'm just not healthy enough to make the trip. Ultimately, she outlives him. They both live to be elderly by the standards of the day. She outlives him, but they do. I mean, in a sense, I guess there's a happy ending, because when he returns to Europe, he does reunite with her, and they live together for the rest of their lives. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. But travel did not sound fun back then.
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't have been weeks on the open ocean. So.
Yes, I understand where she came from. Callan has a question. Could you provide the title of the children's book that depicted the fire at the first house?
I will have to step away from the camera for a moment, but yes, I can get that.
Sure, take your time. I myself am formerly a children's librarian, so this is something that I'm curious about as well. Thank you, Callan.
Well, it's a good read. It was recommended to me by a good friend and colleague, and really the inspiration behind the original Archaeology fellow, Andy Cosentino, Dr. Cosentino. It's called The Scarlet Oak here, and it's by Cornelia Meggs, which is spelled Meigs. Came out in 1938. It's just beautifully illustrated, as you can see. And it's a tale of some children, a young boy really, who is Joseph's neighbor, and how Joseph is essentially a positive influence on this young man. And Cornelia Meggs, the author, is also interesting in that she came from a pretty distinguished family herself. Her father was a very prominent Civil War general. So it's a fun book. I think today we would call it like sort of a teen book. It's not quite Harry Potter, but it's a good read, and you can find it on used book websites and that sort of thing.
Wow, those are treasures to find classics like that. Another question. Did he have a submarine that could go through the tunnels into the river?
Now that is fun to think about. This is becoming like Jules Verne. I love it. So the tunnels are they appear to all start on dry land. So they do take you down to the river, but they're not into the water itself. He does have a boat, right, which he calls his row galley, which sounds so Roman, like a galley. And his daughter, Charlotte, who visits, does a drawing that appears to show it. So that would have been like, he doesn't need to get on the stagecoach if he wants to go to Philadelphia. He's got his own boat to take him there. But I don't think he had a submarine.
You know what, Dr. Veit? I think people are getting ideas about tunnels because from Jordan, I have a question. Are there plans to interpret and make the tunnels ruins publicly accessible? But notice how it's tunnels/ruins. Do we know of any plans?
I don't know if there are plans. I think so. I have mixed feelings about. I think it would be fun to do that, and they are really distinctive. There are very few places in New Jersey where there are historic estates that have tunnels like this. So it would be fun, but I don't know I think we need to bring in some pretty talented engineers to figure out how to make them safe for the future.
I think there's something about tunnels that provides a lot of fascination for people. The tunnels that come to mind to me are from the sugar plantations when I was out in Kauai. Not to give anyone here any ideas, but in Kauai, people are much more, I guess, adventure seeking. And
Right.
I heard many stories of locals in Hawaii, just because the tunnels in Hawaii, they had water going through them and people basically throwing themselves down former sugar plantation tunnels.
Wow.
Just speaking to the locals, this was definitely not recommended in tour guides. So if we do provide in the future, maps of these tunnels, I should hope that people, stay away from causing themselves bodily harm.
That's right. That's right.
Oh my goodness. Louise has a question. You mentioned Commodore Stockton visiting. Do you know if he was a frequent visitor from Princeton, Morven, or do you have any stories about him and his visit?
I don't know if Joseph made it to Morven. I wouldn't be surprised if he did. Stockton I think I would characterize him as a fairly regular visitor. There's one particular incident when Joseph receives permission to sort of formally own the properties that he's purchased. He actually throws a party of a sort for the New Jersey legislators to enable this. And we think that Stockton was at that. And he gives out as sort of party favors. It's kind of amazing, right? But again, he's this former king. He supposedly gave out silver shoe buckles. Right, shoe buckles are a big thing in the early 1800s. They don't have Velcro or snaps or any of that. And he gave out shoe buckles as like the party favors to people who had helped facilitate his ability to own the land. So that's kind of another fun story. Not as well documented as we'd like, but I've seen that one as well.
I'm sure there's so many stories.
They're sort of endless, yes, which is
that
good.
have to be told.
Fun.
Can you say a word about Charles Lucien, his ornithologist nephew? Is from Dennis.
Yes. So it's his nephew and his son-in-law at the same time, Charles Lucien Bonaparte. He is one of early America's most prominent naturalists. He names a number of species, particularly bird species. He's a friend and contemporary of John James Audubon, the very famous early American naturalist. Lucien is a top tier scholar in the 19th century, and he's very involved in all the scientific academies in Philadelphia. And he lives in the lake house with his wife, and apparently had, pretty extensive displays of sort of taxidermied birds, and was out exploring. I think it's kind of wonderful because now we have the Friends of the Abbot Marsh or the Bordentown Hamilton Marsh are doing all sorts of good natural science work, and his nephew, Joseph's nephew, was doing similar work almost 200 years ago. So the fascination with nature at the falls of the Delaware continues.
Wow. We have quite a few more questions. I'm not sure how long you have with us, Dr. Veit, but I will continue asking as long as you're willing.
Yeah, I'm willing. We'll do a couple more. Sure.
Okay. From Terry, the park of Bordentown Bluff seems to be the limit to the property. Was a bridge leading to it in place then?
So that would be down Park Street towards the Park Street apartments, I think. Um, if I understand the geography of her question or his question, the question properly. Um, the estate, I think, actually extended a bit past that, but has been encroached on over the years. So it's probably a little bit further. And he even owns, even in downtown Bordentown proper, he owns some lots. He doesn't have a contiguous swath, but he owns some properties there.
Okay. Max has a question. Max says, I know of a house in Heightstown that has an entry door allegedly from Point Breeze. I suspect it might be from the Victorian mansion built after Bonaparte's second mansion was torn down. Also, a sideboard in Princeton was allegedly from the estate. Can you speak to this, Dr. Veit?
No, but that was Max. You said if Max, I'd love to know more. And why don't I I'll put my email. Is it all right if I put my email in
Yes,
the chat?
please. Please put your
Yeah,
email in the
so
chat.
things like that are just fascinating. And I'd love to know more because those are two examples that I was unfamiliar with. I do know that Wallingford, which is a historic house museum in Western Monmouth County, they have a very fine mantelpiece believed to be from Point Breeze. And they actually have a letter stating that they went to an auction at Point Breeze. So they have sort of good provenance, right, on that. And there is a very fancy bed at an estate in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, that was supposed to come from Point Breeze. But I mean, I get, and it at sometimes like, wow, how did all of this stuff ever fit into it? But I guess given that the house was so large and so magnificent, there are probably a lot of rooms to furnish. And there were when Joseph leaves, there are a series of auctions. One is essentially household furnishings, and one focuses really on art, and from those auctions, pieces of the estate are really dispersed because he's he's a well-known character. Almost, this is going to be a silly analogy, but I almost think of him like an Elvis. So everybody wants something associated with Elvis, like as a talking point in their house. So Joseph's possessions are scattered to the winds and remain talking points until today.
Elvis is a good analogy. I mean, I was even starstruck when I saw Elvis in a Las Vegas post office. I don't know.
Wow.
So I understand. Karen has a comment. She wants to thank you, Professor Veit, but she also says, I'm a direct descendant of Joseph Bonaparte and Anne Savage, and I have much info on Joseph and Anne.
Well, I think the best source that I have, that is fascinating, and a distinguished, ancestry for sure. Patricia Tyson Stroud's book on Joseph Bonaparte has a very thorough discussion of Anne Savage and Joseph. And what I've learned from it, or what I've gleaned from it, is I think it was a relationship where they were really attracted to each other, and I think Anne was also a stronger character than people sometimes give her credit for, because after their relationship had cooled, she is now a mom with two small children living on a property that he's maintaining for her, and she makes a point of sort of saying to him, like, you need to take care of your family, and he does, and she goes on to have other important relationships. She actually goes to France and is introduced at the court there. So I like to think of her, although I obviously never met her, as a strong personality as well. So, but
Wonderful.
Stroud's book would have good information.
That is great to know, because I know several people have asked about his descendants and whether or not they're in the area. So that would be a great source. And perhaps from Karen directly herself. All right. We already have Beth requesting a presentation from Karen. So Karen, you may want to consider that.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. There is another Karen, a different Karen, who wonders if you can recommend a good biography of Joseph Bonaparte.
Again, I will step away for just a moment.
Sure. I love biographies. I'm actually on a memoir kick right now. So it's just wonderful to hear other people's voices.
So there are several. So the most recent, and I think the most scholarly, is The Man Who Had Been King by Patricia Tyson Stroud. I'll put that down here in the chat. And that was published fairly recently, so it's still available.
Dr. Veit, it seems like you have been chatting just to the panelists. So
and I want to chat to everyone. Send chat to all panelists and attendees.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll copy your email and send it to everyone as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
So that's the most recent, but there are a couple classics that you can find that are also fun. One is called The Reluctant King.
Oh, I love these titles.
By Michael Ross. I'll put that in here as well.
I love titles of books. In fact, I'm better at coming up with titles than actually, sometimes people ask, because I'm a librarian, do you ever consider writing your own book? And I'm like, well, you know what? I'm not great at writing a book maybe, but maybe titles. I can come up with titles.
I think if you have a good title, you're halfway there. And then here's another one. These are like my three favorites. The Gentle Bonaparte.
Oh, I love it.
Right, so he's the lover, not the fighter in the family.
Oh yes, I like the image that title conjures. All right. There are questions about the Bow Hill mansion, and Clara grew up down the street from Bow Hill and heard rumors that there were tunnels connecting the Bow Hill mansion with Point Breeze.
So there may be tunnels at Bow Hill too. It's fancy enough, and I've heard those tales as well. I don't want to be cynical, but the geography would make it challenging to connect the two. So I think it's more likely that both estates have tunnels, because they're both up on these high bluffs, and I think tunnels would have been useful to get you down to the lowland. But I'm not sure. I'm not certain that they connect just because they're so far apart.
Okay. Well, that's good to know, but we can dream.
We can.
Can you speak more about Bow Hill? Asked Lori.
I'm not as knowledgeable on it, but the basic history, as I understand it, is that it was built again almost as a speculative venture right after the American Revolution by Barnt Decline, and that it's owned by his family and descendants later. It remains kind of a noteworthy Trenton area. It's in Hamilton Township estate throughout the 19th century. I don't know that any formal archaeology has been done there. Today, it's a Ukrainian cultural center, and it's sort of a museum cultural center on the first floor. But up in the attic, it looks like the 18th century building, and certainly it's well maintained today. I suspect it would be a very interesting site to study archaeologically as well, because it probably speak to, again, sort of the lifestyles of the rich and famous in early 19th century America. And Joseph's, again, Anne Savage lives there. She lives at a couple of different places, but she lives there. It's also believed, and this is very sad, that one of her daughters dies there accidentally, apparently from, this is a terrible way to go, I think. Not that there are any good ways to go, but by a flower pot falling off a second-story windowsill. So that is part of the sort of story of Bow Hill. That daughter is buried in St. Michael's Churchyard in Trenton and has a very elaborate memorial.
Wow, that is tragic. Now, Stacy has a comment and question. She heard that one of his daughters, speaking of his daughters, had a swan sleigh and gave presents to the children at Christmas time. Does that sound familiar to you?
I think she may have. I hadn't heard exactly that story, but Joseph is reputed to have, and his daughters visit him and live with him for a while. He is reputed to have distributed presents to the children of Bordentown. He, today, he would have done well as a publicist. I think he knows how to make friends with people and sort of build relationships. So he's definitely giving out gifts. And the lake he creates, I've heard stories that there were boats actually shaped like swans on the lake, which was again like this incredible conversation piece. And in America in the 1820s, who has heard of such a thing? But Joseph has them. So
Wow. Speaking of stories, Carolyn asked, would you tell the story about Joseph, the Quaker ladies, and the statue of his sister, Pauline Bonaparte?
yeah, so the story, and I sort of alluded to it earlier, but it's a great story. Is that when there are a couple stories with Joseph and Quakers, but one story is that when this group comes to visit him, he tours them through the house, and he seems to do this with regularity for guests, and he shows off the various pieces of art, including that statue of his sister that I showed earlier, Pauline Borghese. And she had, I think she was a challenging sister for Joseph. Let me put it that way. And she is not fully clothed in the statue, as you saw. And one of the Quaker ladies of Bordentown comments that the art is very interesting and the statue is very interesting, but she's wearing too few clothes for our cold northern climate, which I think is kind of a subtle way of saying sort of cover up. There's another great story, kind of Quaker related, about how Joseph and his family go to the Friends meeting house in Bordentown, and he's Catholic, and he's apparently unfamiliar with how Quaker meetings work. So he and his family come in, his entourage, if you will, and they all sort of sit down together, whereas in a meeting house, often the men and the women would sit separately from each other. And then he's very puzzled that there's essentially no mass, like no priest gets up or minister and sort of gives a sermon. Instead, people are standing and speaking. So he finds it very curious. And his religion, his whole religiosity or lack thereof is something that authors have talked about. Some folks say that the Belvedere, the tower he builds, is meant to look like a cross and to be sort of a religious symbol. In the paintings I've seen of it, I do not think it is. But that has been put out there as an idea. So.
That's interesting. There seems to be so much speculation surrounding Joseph Bonaparte.
He left like a trail of stories behind him, like breadcrumbs.
Wow. I don't think that's possible nowadays with social media, but that's amazing. Todd has a question. Given the house was located on the river, I assume a mainstay in their diet was fish and other items found from the water. Did you find any artifacts that point to what they ate?
So the artifacts we found say a little bit about what they ate. We have tremendous evidence for consumption of wine. And Joseph's nickname as King of Spain is, as I learned after doing the project, is Pepe Botellas, which is essentially like Joe Bottles. So probably a lot of entertaining. We have evidence for what is probably a dairy or kind of a milk house with big redware pans. So maybe they're milking cows or making cheeses. We have some very fancy porcelains that he's likely setting his tables with, but fewer food consumption or food related items than you'd expect. We didn't have like a lot of animal bones or anything like that. We do have a description of a meal at his house. It's a spring meal, and it's described as featuring shad, so fish that would be present in the Delaware, and strawberries. And I've always found that sort of kind of fun.
That is fun. I don't know why, whenever I think of strawberries, I just think it's a lot of opulence when you have, that cruise where they provide you with strawberries. Or...
Yes, indeed. Right.
Okay. It looks like we have another person who may be a descendant of
Oh my goodness.
Joseph. Let's see. My ancestor, Heinrich Katzenbach, was Joseph's aide de camp, who emigrated to Trenton with Joseph according to family lore. So not with Joseph, but with Joseph's aide.
I had not heard of him. I wonder, I mean, the name, and I don't want to over assume, it sounds sort of Germanic.
Yeah.
I almost wonder if this could be the fellow who is described as the imposing Hungarian. I realize Hungary and Germany are different places. The imposing Hungarian guard. How interesting.
That is very interesting. Well, you have Dr. Veit's email. I'm sure he would like you to reach
I'd love
out
to hear
him.
more. Yes.
Yes. Also, Carolyn recommends Patricia Stroud's splendid biography of Charles Lucien, the Emperor of Nature.
Yeah, that is a wonderful book as well.
Okay. So Nancy has a question. Where the John Abbott House now stands in Hamilton, Coosa Road, was this part of Joseph's property? And would Joseph's property have extended toward Yardville, Hamilton Square Road and beyond toward Route 130?
I think that was past Joseph's estate. I know that's a very important historic house, but I think that was past Joseph's estate. For folks who are interested, I don't want to try and pull back up the presentation because I'm afraid of things not working out with the Zoom. But I can certainly share a map. If folks were to write to me, I can share a map of what we understand to be the bounds of his estate while he owned it. Again, my colleague Mike Gall did just a tremendous amount of deed research to try and figure out what Joseph owned, and it was a bear of a project because he owned a lot of real estate.
Wow. Stephen has a question about the ground penetrating radar, which I find to be a fascinating technology as well. He wonders if this technology can delineate the extent of the tunnels. It could. Okay, great. Wow.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great point. So initially we did not have funding to do ground penetrating radar. So we started out doing traditional archaeology, excavating by hand. We had a little bit of work that was done by a fellow named Bob Winsek, who works for a company called EPI. And he basically said, there's something, and you have to realize how far the technology has come also in sort of the period since we started work. He said, there is something very large here. And we did our shovel test and boom, that was the house. The more recent radar can kind of give you almost a three-dimensional picture of what's underground. You always still have to excavate to be sure. I've been involved in projects where we think we're seeing something and then we dig and it turns out it's natural. But the tunnels could certainly be traced using radar. That would be, particularly with the second house, which had very extensive network of tunnels. That would be a lot of fun. I think a very productive project.
That sounds very exciting. It's amazing how far technology has come.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine being an archaeologist is a lot different now than it even was like 15 years ago, 10 years ago.
It is. Technology is much more important, both for the field work The other thing, this is going to seem silly, but so social media has changed how we do archaeology. So I showed, I think early on in the presentation, that one map that shows the estate that was found in an archives in France. And as I understand the discovery, it was, again, one of my students, Suzanne Moore, who was posting on her social media that she was working at a field school at Joseph Bonaparte's estate. And a gentleman in France, Vincent Hegel, said, "Oh, I've seen a map here in France," and then sent it to her. I think this was all through Facebook. So it's kind of amazing the connections we can make using technology, and basically how technology can start to help us see below ground before we even excavate.
That's phenomenal. Like you were laying out the walls
Mhm.
of the house even. So could you tell how many rooms were in the home then? This is a question from Terry.
We don't have that sort of detail. We dug several excavation units it went all the way to the base of the cellar. And there are walls that sort of seem to subdivide even the cellar inside the building. So I don't have an exact number of rooms, but clearly there are many rooms within the building.
Okay. You know what, Dr. Veit, we are down to 3 questions.
Okay.
This is great. I know some people may have chatted their questions into the chat window instead. Hold on to those. You have Dr. Veit's email. I'm sure he will be willing to answer them.
I'm
But
happy.
we're down to 3. Monica has a question. Where are Dr. Abbott's artifacts displayed? She also wonders if there'll be a future webinar about him. Monica, feel free to complete our survey, which we will email to you with suggestions for library programs. We are open to them.
The authors of that recent book on Abbott, Carolyn Dillion, who teaches at Coastal Carolina University, and Charles Bellow, who's an archaeologist who works for FEMA, they are compelling speakers. So that's something to think about for the future. So Abbott's artifact collections are a bit scattered, but large portions of them are at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, and another massive collection of artifacts that he unearthed is at Harvard's Peabody Museum. Those are his 2 employers. So there are other scattered pieces at the State Museum, at the Princeton Museum, but those are the 2 largest collections.
Okay. Yes, a possible future program. All right, Bordentown seems to be at the center of a lot of history. This is from Jen. Clara Barton, Bonaparte, Thomas Paine, etc. Any thoughts on why it would be so attractive for so many different historical figures? It's a beautiful town, but rather small and relatively obscure. And Jen says she's just surprised by its rich history.
Yeah, Bordentown historically is like punching over its weight. It is an important place. I think, in part it's geography. So it is, as one travels from New York to Philadelphia in colonial America, the fastest way to do that would be to take a ferry across the Hudson or across the Staten Island and then Perth Amboy, and then to head south on a stagecoach. And those coaches would stop in Bordentown. My impression is it's actually faster and more efficient, even before there was steam power, to get on a boat from Bordentown and go to Philadelphia. So it was really like all these transportation routes were converging there. And it is a beautiful spot to live in. But I think that's one of the reasons it was so attractive to folks like Joseph. For him, I think he wants to be in the center of it all. He wants to be between New York and Philadelphia, so he can always be. He can't. So he can get the news quickly, right? So he's really in the center of America's first grade highway, if you will.
Wonderful. I think I'm going to end with that question because I think it's a beautiful wrap up answer as we reflect on Bordentown and the future of Bonaparte's estate and your further archaeological findings there.
Sounds good. Kim, thank you so much for being a wonderful host, and this was such a pleasure. Thanks for again, taking all these questions, and I really appreciate your help.
No, my pleasure, Dr. Veit. I've been learning so much about history and about archaeology with all of these Zoom programs, even about art. We have so many art programs coming up at our library. So for those who are interested, because I know a number of you found us through this program and have not attended our other programs, but please visit penningtonlibrary.org to see our other upcoming programs. We would love to have you. And Dr. Veit, thank you once again. Thank you also, Bob Worsnack from the Hopewell Museum and Hopewell Valley Historical Society. Thank you to my partner in crime, Tara Russell, who is also here in the call, my other librarian. And this has been a wonderful piece of history, and I look forward to hearing more about it in the future from any book you may publish. Hint, hint.
All right, sounds good.
All right, have a wonderful night, everyone. And
all right, good evening, everyone.
yes, we'll see you next time on Zoom. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.